You watch as others effortlessly sway opinions in meetings while your logical arguments fall on deaf ears. Every day you present facts and reason, yet somehow those who speak to emotions get the promotions, the support, and the influence you deserve. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I mastered the art of moving human hearts and minds in the deadliest political arena of Renaissance Italy, where one wrong move meant exile or death. What I discovered about emotional influence will transform how you navigate any relationship, negotiation, or leadership challenge. The same principles that allowed me to counsel princes and survive the most treacherous courts in history can give you the power to guide any conversation toward your desired outcome. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Machiavellian wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the subtle art of emotional influence. Let me tell you about the moment everything changed for me. It was the winter of 1512, and I was sitting in my study at San Castiano, staring at my reflection in a small bronze mirror that had belonged to my father. 3 months earlier, I had been one of the most powerful men in Florence, second Chancellor of the Republic, trusted advisor to the Soderini government, commander of militias. I controlled armies, negotiated with kings, and shaped the destiny of city-states. Then the Medici returned to power, and in a single day, I lost everything. They didn't just strip me of my position, they accused me of conspiracy, threw me in prison, tortured me. When they finally released me, I was banished to my small estate outside Florence, forbidden from entering the city I had served for 14 years. I went from commanding respect in the halls of power to being a political exile, watching my former influence evaporate like morning mist. But here's what I discovered in that bronze mirror. In that moment of absolute defeat, all my previous power had been an illusion. I had wielded authority, yes, but I had never truly understood influence. I could command obedience through my official position, but I had failed to master the one thing that truly moves human beings, their emotions. During my years in government, I had operated like most leaders do today. I believed that logic, facts, and rational arguments were the tools of influence. I would present well-reasoned proposals backed by data and precedent, assuming that intelligent people would naturally see the wisdom of my position. When people disagreed with me, I attributed it to their lack of understanding or their inferior reasoning abilities. How wrong I was. The mirror showed me a man who had confused position with power, authority with influence. In my exile, stripped of all official roles, I began to observe human nature with fresh eyes. I watched the villagers in San Castiano, studied how they interacted, noticed what moved them to action and what left them unmoved. I reflected on my years in government, analyzing not just what had happened, but why people had responded as they did. I realized that in every successful negotiation I had conducted, in every moment when I had truly influenced someone's decision, logic had played only a supporting role. The real power had come from understanding and appealing to what people felt, not just what they thought. Fear, pride, hope, envy, love, ambition, these were the forces that truly governed human behavior. This insight transformed me from a political operator into a student of human nature. I began to see that the ability to understand and guide emotions wasn't just useful for politicians or leaders, was the foundation of all meaningful human influence. Whether you're trying to win support for a project at work, negotiate a better deal, or simply get your family to agree on dinner plans, success depends on your ability to connect with what people feel. That same winter, by candlelight in my small study, I began writing what would become The Prince. I still have the original manuscript pages, covered with my corrections and marginal notes. Looking at those early drafts now, I can see how my understanding evolved with each revision. The conventional wisdom of my time said that a good ruler should be loved, moral, and consistent. I had believed this myself, until I witnessed the rise and fall of Cesare Borgia. I had observed Cesare closely during my diplomatic missions to his court. Here was a man who understood something that eluded most leaders: the difference between forcing compliance and inspiring genuine commitment. Traditional rulers relied on their official authority, issuing commands and expecting obedience because of their position. Cesare understood that real power came from his ability to make people want to follow him. I watched him in action during a particularly tense negotiation with the lords of Romania. These were proud, independent men who had ruled their territories for generations. Any other leader would have simply demanded their submission, threatening military consequences for refusal. Instead, Cesare began by acknowledging their strength and accomplishments. He spoke of their territories not as conquests, but as valuable additions to a grand vision they could help shape. He didn't argue with their concerns, he validated them. When they expressed fear about losing their independence, he didn't dismiss these fears or try to logic them away. Instead, he painted a picture of how joining him would actually increase their security and influence. He made them feel that cooperation was their idea, that they were choosing to ally with him rather than being forced into submission. What struck me most was how he handled their emotional states. When one lord became angry and started shouting, Cesare didn't match his intensity or try to dominate him. Instead, he remained calm and actually acknowledged the man's passion, saying, "I can see how deeply you care about your people. That's exactly the kind of commitment I need from my allies." The angry lord went from adversary to advocate in a single conversation. This was my first glimpse into the gap between commanding obedience and inspiring loyalty. Anyone with sufficient military force can make people comply with their demands, but creating genuine commitment, the kind where people actively support your goals even when you're not watching, requires a completely different approach. Most leaders today make the same mistake I made in my early career. They focus on being right rather than being influential. They present logical arguments and expect people to be swayed by facts and reason. When people resist their ideas, they assume the problem is a lack of information or understanding. But here's what I learned from watching both successful and failed leaders. People make decisions with their emotions and then use logic to justify those decisions. If you want to truly influence someone, you must first connect with what they feel, then provide the logical framework that allows them to feel good about their emotional choice. The traditional advice tells leaders to be consistent, transparent, and moral. While these qualities have their place, they miss the essential truth about human nature. People need to feel something before they will act on anything. Fear motivates action faster than logic. Pride drives decisions more powerfully than policy. Hope sustains commitment longer than contracts. This is why so many technically competent people struggle with leadership. They master the skills of their profession but never learn the art of moving hearts and minds. They can analyze problems brilliantly and design perfect solutions, but they cannot inspire others to implement those solutions with passion and commitment. In my desk, I keep a sealed letter from Lorenzo de' Medici that arrived just before my exile commission that would have changed everything if I had understood then what I know now. But that letter also taught me the first and most fundamental principle of emotional influence. People are driven by self-interest, not logic, and until you understand what someone truly wants, you cannot hope to influence them. The letter offered me a position in the new Medici administration, despite my previous service to their enemies. At first, I was baffled. Why would they want someone who had worked against their return to power? I analyzed it from every logical angle. They needed my administrative experience, or maybe they wanted to keep potential opponents close. I responded with a carefully reasoned argument about my qualifications and my commitment to serving Florence's best interests. They never replied. Years later, I realized my mistake. I had focused on what I thought they should want, administration and loyal service, rather than understanding what they actually wanted. The Medici were newly returned to power after years of exile. They didn't need more qualified administrators. They needed to project strength and unity. They wanted former opponents who would publicly acknowledge their legitimacy and authority. Had I understood this, I would have crafted my response entirely differently. Instead of listing my administrative accomplishments, I would have acknowledged their rightful return to leadership. Instead of promising efficient service, I would have expressed gratitude for their magnanimous offer of reconciliation. I would have made them feel powerful and wise, rather than simply competent. This lesson transformed how I approached every subsequent interaction. I learned to listen not just to what people said, but to what their words revealed about their deeper emotional needs. When someone presents a logical argument, they're usually trying to satisfy an emotional desire. When they object to your proposal with rational concerns, they're often expressing an emotional fear. I developed a practice of asking myself 3 questions before any important conversation. What does this person fear? What do they desire? What would make them feel powerful, secure, or valued? The answers to these questions became my roadmap for influence. For example, when negotiating with French officials during my diplomatic missions, I learned that their primary emotional need was to feel respected as a major European power. They didn't just want favorable terms, they wanted to feel that those terms reflected their importance and sophistication. So instead of simply proposing agreements, I would frame them as opportunities for France to demonstrate its wisdom and leadership to other nations. The technique is remarkably simple once you understand it. Before presenting any request or proposal, identify the emotional payoff you can offer. If someone fears being overlooked, show them how your proposal increases their visibility. If they desire respect, frame your request as recognition of their expertise. If they want to feel important, ask for their advice rather than their compliance. In modern workplaces, I see this principle violated constantly. People pitch ideas by focusing on logical benefits, increased efficiency, cost savings, better outcomes. While these factors matter, they rarely motivate action by themselves. The colleague who gets promoted is usually the one who makes the boss feel smart for choosing them. The proposal that gets approved is typically the one that makes decision makers feel wise and forward-thinking for supporting it. Start paying attention to the emotional subtext in every conversation. When someone says, "I need to think about it," they're usually feeling uncertain or pressured. When they say it's not in the budget, they might be afraid of taking financial risks. When they say, "We've always done it this way," they're often feeling anxious about change or protective of their past decisions. Once you identify the real, emotional need beneath the surface objection, you can address it directly while still engaging with their logical concerns. This creates the powerful combination of emotional satisfaction and rational justification that drives genuine commitment. I still carry the diplomatic seal that opened doors across Renaissance Europe, a small piece of wax and metal that taught me the second principle of emotional influence. Emotions are contagious and can be deliberately transmitted from one person to another. This discovery revolutionized how I approached every negotiation, from tense meetings with cardinals in Rome to delicate discussions with the French court. My breakthrough came during a particularly difficult negotiation with Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, later Pope Julius II. I had been sent to secure Florence's neutrality in the Papal Wars, but the Cardinal was furious about our previous alliances. He began our meeting in a state of barely controlled rage, pacing behind his desk, his voice rising with each accusation he leveled against Florence's policies. My first instinct was to remain calm and rational, to counter his emotion with logic and facts. This approach had worked in academic debates, but here it only seemed to increase his agitation. The more reasoned I became, the more emotional he grew. I realized I was creating a contrast that made him feel foolish for his passion, which only intensified his anger. Then I tried something different. Instead of contrasting his emotion, I matched it. I allowed concern to enter my voice, not anger, but genuine worry about the situation he was describing. I leaned forward, mirroring his intensity, and said, "Your Eminence, I can see this troubles you deeply, and frankly, it troubles me as well. Florence never intended to create such difficulties." The change was immediate. His shoulders relaxed slightly, his voice lowered, and for the first time in our meeting, he truly listened to what I was saying. By matching his emotional state rather than opposing it, I had created a sense of alignment rather than conflict. From there, I was able to gradually guide both of us toward a calmer, more productive discussion. This became my method for every subsequent negotiation. I learned to read the emotional climate of any room and then consciously adjust my own emotional expression to create the atmosphere I wanted. If someone came to me anxious and hurried, I would begin with a slightly elevated energy level, then gradually slow down, breathing more deeply, speaking more deliberately. They would unconsciously match my shift toward calm. The technique works because of a fundamental truth about human psychology. We naturally synchronize with the emotional states of people around us. You've experienced this yourself. You enter a room where people are laughing and you feel lighter, or you encounter someone who's stressed and you begin to feel tense. This emotional contagion happens automatically, but you can learn to use it strategically. During my negotiations with King Louis XII of France, I discovered how to transmit confidence even when I felt uncertain. The French court was intimidating, grand, formal, filled with nobles who viewed representatives from Italian city-states as minor players. I could have allowed their sense of superiority to make me feel small and defensive. Instead, I deliberately cultivated an internal state of quiet confidence before each meeting. I reminded myself of Florence's achievements, our contributions to European commerce and culture. I focused on the value we brought to any alliance. Then I let this confidence show in my posture, my voice, and my willingness to make direct eye contact with even the most powerful nobles. The remarkable thing was how quickly they began to treat me as an equal. By projecting confidence, I had transmitted it to them, and they responded to me as someone worthy of that confidence. Their behavior then reinforced my own sense of authority, creating a positive cycle that benefited both sides. You can apply this same principle in any situation where you need to influence the emotional atmosphere. Before an important meeting, decide what emotional state would serve you best. If you need people to feel excited about a new project, cultivate genuine enthusiasm within yourself first. If you need them to take a serious problem seriously, allow yourself to feel the appropriate level of concern. The key is authenticity within strategy. You're not pretending to feel something you don't feel. You're choosing which of your genuine emotions to emphasize and express. This creates emotional leadership ability to guide a group toward the emotional state that will best serve everyone's interests. In my study sits a chess set that Cesare Borgia gave me after one of our strategic discussions, each piece carved from ivory and ebony, representing the delicate balance of power I learned to master. This gift taught me the third principle of emotional influence. Fear and admiration are more reliable foundations for lasting influence than love, though the art lies in balancing them perfectly. Cesare understood something that most leaders miss entirely. He once told me, "Niccolò, people's love is fickle. It changes with their circumstances, their moods, their immediate needs. But respect born from a combination of capability and consequence endures." I watched him demonstrate this principle with his own commanders, his allies, and even his enemies. When dealing with the mercenary captains who served his armies, Cesare never tried to make them love him. Instead, He made them admire his strategic brilliance and fear the consequences of betraying him. He would praise their tactical skills in public, consult them on important decisions, and ensure they profited from their service. But he also made it clear that disloyalty would be met with swift and certain punishment. The captains served him with unwavering dedication, not because they felt affection for him, but because they respected his competence and understood the cost of opposition. This loyalty proved far more reliable than the emotional attachments I had seen other leaders try to cultivate. I learned to apply this principle in my own dealings, though with more subtlety than Cesar's, sometimes brutal, methods. When I returned to limited service under the Medici years later, I focused on demonstrating competence rather than trying to win personal approval. I became known for delivering exactly what I promised, when I promised it. I also made it clear politely, but firmly, that my expertise came with certain professional standards. For instance, when asked to provide political analysis, I would give my honest assessment regardless of whether it was what they wanted to hear. I built a reputation for reliability and insight, which made my opinions valuable even when they were uncomfortable. People began to seek my counsel not because they enjoyed my company, but because they trusted my judgment and feared making important decisions without it. This approach works beautifully in modern professional environments. The colleague who tries to be everyone's friend often finds their influence diminishing over time. People like them personally, but they don't necessarily respect their judgment or fear the consequences of ignoring their input. In contrast, the person who consistently delivers excellent work and maintains clear professional boundaries tends to accumulate genuine influence. The key is understanding what I call respectful authority. You want people to admire your capabilities and understand that there are consequences for disrespecting your contributions. But you must achieve this without becoming harsh or intimidating. The fear should be about missing out on your value, not about personal retaliation. I developed several techniques for building this kind of respectful authority. First, I learned to under-promise and over-deliver consistently. If I said a report would be ready Thursday, it was ready Wednesday evening. If I promised to research 3 options, I provided 5. This reliability made people depend on me and fear the inconvenience of my absence. Second, I mastered the art of calm confidence in difficult situations. When others panicked or became emotional, I remained steady and solution-focused. This made me valuable during crises and created a healthy respect for my judgment under pressure. Third, I learned to say no gracefully but firmly when requests fell outside my expertise or availability. Rather than trying to please everyone, I protected my reputation by only taking on work I could excel at. This selectivity actually increased demand for my services. The dangerous trap that many people fall into is seeking universal approval. They want everyone to like them, so they avoid any action that might create discomfort or disagreement. But this approach undermines the very respect they're trying to build. People admire those who have clear standards and the courage to maintain them. The balance lies in being demanding of excellence while remaining personally gracious, being firm about boundaries while staying collaborative in spirit. You want people to think, I respect their judgment and wouldn't want to disappoint them, rather than I'm afraid they'll be mean to me or I hope they'll like me. Hidden in my desk is a coded journal where I recorded my observations of human nature patterns across decades of political service. Written in a cipher only I could read, it contains the 4th principle that transformed my understanding of influence. Timing determines the impact of any emotional appeal, and mastering this rhythm can multiply your persuasive power exponentially. Learned this lesson through painful experience during my early diplomatic career. Fresh from university, armed with brilliant arguments and innovative solutions, I would charge into negotiations ready to present my ideas immediately. I believed that the strength of my logic would overcome any resistance, regardless of when or how I presented it. My first major failure came during negotiations with the Florentine guilds over military funding. I had developed a comprehensive plan for a citizen militia that would reduce our dependence on expensive mercenaries. The logic was flawless, the cost savings significant, the strategic advantages clear. I presented my proposal at the very beginning of our first meeting, expecting immediate acceptance. Instead, I encountered fierce resistance. Guild leaders questioned every detail, raised objections I hadn't anticipated, and ultimately rejected the entire plan. I left frustrated and confused, certain that politics had triumphed over reason. Months later, I observed a master negotiator handle a similar situation completely differently. Instead of leading with his proposal, he began by asking questions. He inquired about the guild leaders' current concerns, listened to their complaints about existing policies, and gradually built a picture of their emotional state and priorities. Only after an hour of this careful listening did he begin to plant seeds related to his ultimate proposal. He mentioned a successful militia program in another city, wondered aloud about the long-term costs of mercenary dependence, asked their opinion on citizen training methods. By the time he formally presented his plan, the ground was perfectly prepared. I realized that I had been trying to harvest before I had planted. Emotional influence requires cultivation, not just presentation. People need time to warm to new ideas, especially ideas that challenge their current assumptions or require them to change their behavior. This insight led me to develop what I came to think of as emotional seasons. Just as farmers understand that different crops require different planting and harvesting times, influential people learn to recognize when others are ready to receive different types of appeals. During my later negotiations with various Italian city-states, I would spend entire meetings simply assessing the emotional climate. Was the other party feeling secure or threatened? Were they in an expansive mood or a defensive one? Were they focused on immediate problems or long-term opportunities? These observations determined not just what I would propose, but when. I learned to recognize the signs of emotional readiness. When people began asking questions about possibilities rather than defending current practices, they were becoming open to change. When they started sharing their frustrations voluntarily, they were ready to hear about solutions. When they began speaking about their aspirations rather than their constraints, they were prepared for ambitious proposals. The technique I developed was to plant emotional seeds early and tend them patiently. If I wanted someone to consider a significant change, I would begin by sharing stories about similar changes that had worked elsewhere. I would ask questions that led them to articulate their own dissatisfaction with current approaches. I would validate their concerns while gradually introducing new possibilities. This process might take weeks or even months, but the results were far more sustainable than forced agreements. When people felt that they had participated in developing an idea rather than having it imposed on them, their commitment was genuine and lasting. In today's fast-paced business environment, this patience seems like a luxury few can afford. But I've observed that rushing emotional influence often creates the need to repeat the entire process later. The executive who takes time to understand his team's concerns before proposing changes finds those changes implemented more quickly and completely than the one who announces new policies without preparation. The key is learning to read emotional temperatures accurately, pay attention to body language, tone of voice, the types of questions people ask, and the stories they choose to share. These signals tell you whether someone is ready to hear your message or whether you need to invest more time in preparation. On my bookshelf rests a broken crowner, fragment from the regalia of a deposed prince who ignored the fifth principle of emotional influence. Never underestimate the power of wounded pride. I witnessed his downfall firsthand, and it taught me that the ability to deliver difficult messages without creating enemies is perhaps the most crucial skill any leader can master. Prince Vitellazzo Vitelli had been one of the most capable military commanders in Italy, but he made a fatal error in how he handled a dispute with one of his own captains. The captain had failed in a minor engagement, and Vitellazzo decided to make an example of him. Rather than addressing the failure privately, he chose to humiliate the man publicly, stripping him of his command in front of the entire army and mocking his tactical abilities. The captain said nothing, accepted his punishment with apparent grace, and quietly departed. Vitellazzo believed he had handled the situation decisively and effectively. What he failed to recognize was that he had created a mortal enemy whose wounded pride would fester into a desire for revenge. Months later, that same captain provided crucial intelligence to Vitellazzo's enemies, revealing the prince's battle plans and troop positions. The betrayal led directly to Vitellazzo's capture and execution. A moment of public humiliation had cost him his life. I learned from this tragedy that pride is the most dangerous emotion to wound because it creates the most persistent desire for retaliation. Unlike anger, which eventually cools, or fear, which can be addressed through reassurance, wounded pride burns steadily until it finds an opportunity for revenge. This understanding transformed how I approached every difficult conversation. Throughout my career, when I needed to deliver criticism, refuse requests, or correct mistakes, I developed techniques that preserved the other person's dignity while still achieving my objectives. The key insight is that people can accept almost any negative message if you frame it in a way that allows them to maintain they need to feel that their fundamental competence and worth remain intact, even if their specific action or decision was problematic. During my service in the Second Chancery, I often had to reject proposals from ambitious junior officials, rather than simply explaining why their ideas wouldn't work. I learned to acknowledge the quality of their thinking while redirecting their efforts. I might say, this shows exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. I wonder if we could apply this same creativity to the Pisa situation, where we have more flexibility to experiment. This approach accomplished several things simultaneously. It preserved their pride by recognizing their capabilities. It redirected their energy toward more productive channels, and it made them feel valued rather than dismissed. Instead of creating resentment, these conversations often strengthened working relationships. I also discovered the power of private correction followed by public support. When someone made a mistake that needed addressing, I would discuss it with them privately first, giving them the opportunity to understand the issue and propose solutions. Then, in public settings, I would find ways to highlight their strengths and contributions. This technique was particularly effective with the Florentine magistrates, who were often proud and politically sensitive. If I needed to suggest changes to their policies, I would first meet with them individually to explain my concerns and hear their perspectives. By the time we discussed the issues in public meetings, they felt like partners in developing solutions rather than targets of criticism. Another crucial technique is what I learned to call blame the situation, not the person. Instead of saying, someone made a poor decision, I would frame it as a challenging situation that didn't have obvious solutions. Instead of criticizing their judgment, I would acknowledge the difficulty of their position and suggest additional factors they might want to consider. This approach is especially important when dealing with people who have authority or influence of their own. The magistrate who feels foolish will look for opportunities to demonstrate his wisdom at your expense. The colleague who feels diminished will find ways to diminish you in return. But the person who feels that their dignity has been preserved, even in correction, often becomes a stronger ally than before. The modern workplace offers countless opportunities to practice this principle. When a team member's work needs improvement, focus on specific behaviors rather than character judgments. When a colleague's idea has flaws, acknowledge its merits before suggesting modifications. When you must refuse a request, explain the constraints, rather than simply saying no. Among my most treasured possessions is a merchant's ledger from a Florentine banker who taught me the sixth principle of emotional influence. Every interaction is an emotional transaction, and sustainable influence requires ensuring that others feel they gain more than they give. This insight revolutionized my understanding of how to build long-term alliances and avoid the trap of short-term manipulation. I met Cosimo Ruscelli during my diplomatic travels, when I needed financing for a delicate mission to France. Most people would have approached this as a simple business transaction. I needed money. He had money. We would negotiate terms. But Cosimo taught me to think about the emotional economics underlying every exchange. "Niccolò," he said, as we sat in his banking house, "anyone can lend money and charge interest. But I stay in business because people feel good about their dealings with me. They walk away feeling wise for having chosen me, rather than feeling exploited or diminished." He showed me how he structured even routine transactions to create emotional profit for his clients. When approving a loan, he wouldn't just announce his decision, he would explain why the client's proposal impressed him, what he saw in their character that made them a good risk, how their success would benefit the broader community. By the time clients left his office, they felt not just approved for funding, but validated as capable and trustworthy individuals. This approach created extraordinary loyalty. Clients would return to Cosimo even when competitors offered better rates, because the emotional experience of working with him was consistently positive. They trusted his judgment, valued his confidence in them, and enjoyed the feeling of being respected and understood. I began applying this principle to my own diplomatic relationships with remarkable results. Instead of viewing negotiations as zero-sum contests where one side's gain meant the other's loss, I looked for ways to create emotional wins for everyone involved. During peace negotiations between Florence and Pisa, I realized that the Pisan representatives needed to feel that they were achieving something meaningful for their city, not just accepting defeat. Rather than simply dictating terms, I helped them identify aspects of the agreement they could present to their people as victory-straight privileges, cultural exchanges, recognition of their historical importance. The key was understanding that people's willingness to cooperate depends largely on how the cooperation makes them feel about themselves. If they feel diminished or exploited, they will look for opportunities to rebalance the relationship in their favor. If they feel elevated and valued, they will work to maintain and strengthen the connection. I developed a practice of keeping an emotional ledger for important relationships. After each significant interaction, I would ask myself, did this person walk away feeling better or worse about themselves? Did they gain confidence, recognition, or satisfaction from our exchange? If I had taken more than I had given emotionally, I knew I needed to rebalance the account. This doesn't mean being artificially flattering or manipulative. Genuine emotional profit comes from truly seeing and acknowledging people's strengths, contributions, and potential. It means finding authentic ways to make others feel capable, valued, and successful through their interactions with you. For example, when I needed information from various contacts throughout Italy, I learned to frame my requests as opportunities for them to demonstrate their expertise and insider knowledge. Instead of simply asking what they knew about a particular situation, I would say something like, "Your understanding of these matters is so much deeper than mine. I'm hoping you might help me see what I'm missing." This approach accomplished multiple objectives. It gathered the information I needed, it made my contacts feel respected and valuable, and it strengthened our ongoing relationship. They walked away feeling wise and important, which made them more likely to share information with me in the future. The same principle applies in modern professional relationships. The manager who makes team members feel capable and appreciated will find them more willing to take on challenging assignments. The colleague who helps others look good in meetings will discover that others reciprocate when opportunities arise. The crucial insight is that emotional debt, like financial debt, eventually comes due. If you consistently take more emotional value than you give, making others feel diminished, ignored, or exploited, they will eventually find ways to collect what they feel they're owed. But if you create consistent emotional profit for others, they become invested in your success because it validates their good judgment in supporting you. Hanging on my wall is a war banner from one of the few battles won through morale rather than military superiority, tattered piece of silk that taught me the seventh principle of emotional influence. Group emotions amplify individual emotions exponentially, and the person who can read and guide collective emotional states becomes the natural center of any organization. The banner comes from the Battle of Ravenna, where I witnessed something extraordinary. The Florentine forces were outnumbered and outgunned, facing professional French troops with superior equipment and training. By all logical calculations, we should have been routed quickly. Instead, our commander, Giovanni di Medici, understood something about group psychology that transformed the entire engagement. Rather than focusing on tactical superiority he couldn't achieve, Giovanni focused on emotional leadership he could control. Before the battle, he moved among the troops, not giving speeches about duty or glory, but having individual conversations about what they were fighting for. He asked about their families, their hopes for Florence's future, their pride in their units. What I observed was remarkable. As individual soldiers shared their personal motivations, their emotional intensity began to spread to others around them. Fear transformed into determination, anxiety became focused energy, and personal concerns evolved into collective purpose. By the time the battle began, our numerically inferior force fought with an intensity that surprised even their French opponents. This taught me that group emotions operate by different rules than individual emotions. In one-on-one interactions, you can influence someone's emotional state through careful attention to their specific needs and concerns. But in groups, emotions spread organically from person to person, amplifying and transforming as they move. Through the collective, I began studying this phenomenon during my time organizing Florence's citizen militias. Traditional military thinking focused on training individuals to follow orders effectively, but I discovered that the most powerful forces were those where emotional commitment spread naturally through the ranks. The key insight was learning to identify and work with emotional contagion patterns. In any group, certain individuals serve as emotional transmitters. Their feelings spread more readily to others. These aren't necessarily the formal leaders or the most talkative people. They're often the ones that others instinctively look to for cues about how to feel about situations. I learned to identify these emotional influences early in any group process. During city council meetings, I would watch not just who spoke most persuasively, but whose reactions seemed to influence others' reactions. The councilman who could make others feel optimistic or concerned with a gesture or expression often had more impact on final decisions than those who presented the most logical arguments. Once I understood this dynamic, I could use it strategically. If I wanted to build enthusiasm for a proposal, I would first convince one or two key emotional transmitters. Their genuine excitement would spread naturally through the group, creating momentum that logical arguments alone could never achieve. The technique requires understanding the emotional needs of the collective, not just individuals. Groups of personalities, just like people do. Some groups value harmony and consensus above all else. Others thrive on debate and competition. Some are naturally optimistic and forward-looking, while others are cautious and traditional. During negotiations with the various Italian city-states, I learned to read these collective personalities quickly. The Venetians prided themselves on pragmatic sophistication, so I would frame proposals in terms of smart business decisions. The Milanese valued innovation and progress, so I emphasized the forward-thinking aspects of any agreement. The Romans were concerned with dignity and historical significance, so I connected every discussion to their legacy and reputation. This approach works powerfully in modern organizations. The team that values excellence will respond to challenges, framed as opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. The group that prioritizes security will support changes presented as ways to reduce risk. The organization that sees itself as innovative will embrace proposals positioned as cutting-edge solutions. But perhaps the most important aspect of group emotional influence is learning to become what I call an emotional anchor, the person who helps stabilize collective emotions during turbulent times. When groups face uncertainty, anxiety, or conflict, they unconsciously look for someone who can provide emotional stability and direction. I cultivated this role by developing consistent emotional responses to common situations. When crises arose, I would acknowledge the seriousness without becoming panicked, express confidence in our ability to find solutions without minimizing real challenges. This emotional steadiness made me a natural focal point during difficult periods, which translated into substantial influence over group decisions. In my private papers lies a confession letter. I never sent a document that taught me the eighth principle of emotional influence. Vulnerability creates deeper connections than strength, but only when shared strategically and with purpose. This counterintuitive truth revolutionized my understanding of how authentic leadership actually works. The letter was written during my darkest period of exile, when I felt completely abandoned by former allies and uncertain about my future. In my despair, I had drafted a message to Lorenzo de' Medici, confessing my fears about irrelevance, my regrets about past decisions, and my desperate hope for redemption. I poured out my genuine feelings with raw honesty, thinking that showing my humanity might inspire compassion. But as I read the letter the next morning, I realized it would have destroyed any remaining influence I might have had, not because vulnerability itself is weakness, but because I had shared it without purpose or strategy. The letter made me appear helpless rather than human, desperate rather than authentic. This experience taught me the crucial distinction between destructive vulnerability and strategic openness. True influence often requires showing carefully chosen aspects of your humanity, but it must be done in ways that build connection rather than undermine confidence. I learned this lesson more completely through observing Pope Alexander VI, one of the most politically successful figures of my era. Despite his reputation for ruthlessness, Alexander was remarkably skilled at using personal revelation to strengthen his relationships with key allies. During a private dinner I attended at the Vatican, Alexander shared with a small group of cardinals his genuine concerns about the challenges facing the Church. He spoke about his sleepless nights, worrying about political threats, his fears for the Church's future, even his doubts about some of his own decisions. But he framed these revelations not as confessions of weakness, but as evidence of how deeply he cared about their shared mission. The effect was extraordinary. These powerful men, who were normally guarded and calculating in their interactions with the Pope, began sharing their own concerns and fears. The conversation deepened from political maneuvering to genuine collaboration. By showing his humanity, Alexander had created space for others to show theirs, which built stronger bonds than any amount of papal authority could have achieved. I began experimenting with this approach in my own relationships, always with careful attention to timing and purpose. When working with the Florentine militia commanders, I would occasionally share my own uncertainties about strategic decisions, but always in the context of seeking their wisdom and input. This made them feel valued as advisors rather than simply subordinates. which increased their commitment to our shared objectives. The key is understanding what I came to call purposeful vulnerability. You share personal challenges or uncertainties, not to elicit sympathy, but to build trust, demonstrate your humanity, and create space for deeper connection. The vulnerability must serve the relationship and the shared goals, not just your emotional needs. I developed several guidelines for effective vulnerability. First, share struggles that others can relate to, not problems that make you seem uniquely troubled or incapable. Everyone understands the challenge of difficult decisions, but not everyone can relate to profound personal crises. Second, combine vulnerability with competence. Show that you're human enough to have doubts, but capable enough to work through them effectively. The goal is to appear thoughtful and self-aware, not overwhelmed or indecisive. Third, use vulnerability to invite collaboration rather than requesting rescue. Frame your openness as a way to build stronger partnerships, not as a plea for help or support. During my later consulting work with various Italian princes, I would often begin difficult strategic conversations by acknowledging my own uncertainties about the situation. I might say, "I've been wrestling with this problem myself, and I suspect you have as well. Perhaps we can think through it together." This approach made them feel like partners in problem solving rather than recipients of my advice. The modern workplace offers countless opportunities to apply this principle. The manager who admits she doesn't have all the answers but is committed to finding them with her team builds stronger loyalty than one who pretends omniscience. The colleague who acknowledges the challenges of a project while expressing confidence in the team's ability to overcome them creates more genuine motivation than one who minimizes difficulties. Among my most prized documents are the treaty papers, from the League of Cambrai negotiations agreements that succeeded not through superior bargaining positions, but through my mastery of the ninth principle of emotional influence. Frame every request in terms of the other person's emotional needs, and they will feel heroic rather than imposed upon for helping you. The negotiations were extraordinarily complex, involving France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and several Italian states, each with conflicting interests and deep historical grievances. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed repeatedly, with each party focused on what they wanted to extract from the others. I approached these talks with a completely different strategy. Instead of beginning with Florence's needs, I spent weeks studying what each party most wanted to feel about themselves and their role in European affairs. The French wanted to feel like sophisticated power brokers bringing order to Italian chaos. The Spanish needed to feel that their growing influence was being properly recognized. The smaller Italian states desperately wanted to feel that their independence and dignity were being respected. Armed with this emotional intelligence, I crafted my proposals not as requests for concessions, but as opportunities for each party to embody their highest aspirations. When discussing trade agreements with France, I framed them not as benefits to Florence, but as examples of French wisdom in fostering prosperity throughout their sphere of influence. To the Spanish representatives, I presented our military cooperation proposals as recognition of their emerging leadership in European security affairs. I made them feel that supporting Florence was a way of demonstrating their sophisticated understanding of Italian politics and their commitment to stability. The transformation in these negotiations was remarkable. Instead of viewing my requests as impositions or attempts to extract value from them, each party began to see supporting Florence as consistent with their own noble objectives. They felt good about helping us because I had connected their assistance to their deepest sense of purpose and identity. This principle became the foundation of all my subsequent diplomatic work. I learned that people will go to extraordinary lengths to help you if they feel that doing so makes them better versions of themselves. But they will resist even reasonable requests if those requests make them feel diminished, exploited, or inconsistent with their self-image. The technique requires understanding not just what people want, but how they want to feel about getting it. During my work with Florentine merchants seeking favorable trading terms, I discovered that simply offering mutual benefit wasn't enough. The merchants needed to feel that the agreements reflected their business acumen and their contribution to Florence's prosperity. So instead of presenting trade deals as simple exchanges of goods and services, I framed them as examples of the merchant strategic vision and their patriotic commitment to strengthening Florence's economy. I made them feel like economic statesmen rather than mere businessmen, which motivated them to accept terms they might have rejected if presented differently. I developed what I came to think of as heroic framing, the art of presenting any request as an opportunity for the other person to demonstrate their best qualities. When I needed information from various contacts throughout Italy, I didn't simply ask for intelligence. Instead, I would explain how their unique insights could help prevent conflicts or protect innocent people from political upheaval. This approach worked because it aligned my needs with their desire to see themselves as wise, important, and morally significant. They provided information not just to help me, but to fulfill their own sense of purpose and responsibility. The same principle applies powerfully in modern professional contexts. When asking colleagues for support on projects, frame your requests in terms of their expertise and the value they bring. Instead of saying, "I need your help with this analysis," try, "Your analytical skills could really elevate this project, and I think your insights would be invaluable." When seeking approval from supervisors, connect your proposals to their leadership goals and vision for the organization. Show them how supporting your initiative allows them to demonstrate the qualities they most value in themselves. Innovation, strategic thinking, commitment to excellence. The key is authentic connection between your request and their genuine aspirations. You're not manipulating them into helping you. You're helping them see how their assistance serves purposes they already care about deeply. This creates what I call aligned motivation. They want to help you because doing so serves their own highest intentions. The exile proclamation that banished me from Florence sits framed on my wall not as a reminder of failure, but as a testament to the 10th and perhaps most crucial principle of emotional influence. Your emotional state determines your influence capacity, and mastering your inner condition is the foundation upon which all other influence rests. When that proclamation was issued in 1512, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could allow bitterness, resentment, and despair to consume me, or I could use this devastating setback as an opportunity to develop unshakable inner strength. The decision I made in those dark months shaped not only my personal resilience, but my entire approach to human influence. The initial shock was overwhelming. One day, I was second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, trusted with the most sensitive diplomatic missions, commanding respect from princes and prelates across Europe. The next day, I was a political exile, forbidden from entering the city. I had served for 14 years, suspected of treason, and facing an uncertain future. My first instinct was to rage against the injustice, to plot my return to power, to nurse my wounds and blame my enemies. But I quickly realized that these emotional responses, however natural, were destroying my capacity to think clearly and act effectively. Anger clouded my judgment, resentment poisoned my relationships, and despair sapped my energy for productive action. I began developing what I came to call emotional sovereignty, the ability to choose my emotional state regardless of external circumstances. This wasn't about suppressing feelings or pretending problems didn't exist. Instead, it was about taking responsibility for my internal condition and refusing to let outside events dictate my inner life. The practice began with simple, daily routines. Each morning, I would take time to consciously choose how I wanted to feel and behave that day. If I felt anger rising about my situation, I would acknowledge it, but then redirect my energy toward productive activities, reading, analyzing political developments from my forced perspective as an observer. I discovered that emotional states are remarkably contagious, but they flow both ways. Just as others' emotions can influence yours, your emotional condition profoundly affects everyone around you. During my exile, when former allies visited my estate, they often arrived expecting to find a broken, bitter man. Instead, they encountered someone who had maintained his intellectual curiosity, his strategic thinking, and his fundamental optimism about human potential. This unexpected emotional strength had a profound impact on these relationships. People who had come to offer sympathy found themselves seeking counsel. Visitors who expected to console a defeated politician left feeling inspired by a philosopher who had transformed adversity into wisdom. My emotional resilience became a form of influence more powerful than any official position I had held. I learned to apply this principle systematically in all my subsequent interactions. Before any important conversation or negotiation, I would spend time cultivating the emotional state that would best serve my objectives. If I needed to inspire confidence, I would focus on examples of past successes and future possibilities. If I needed to convey serious concern, I would connect with my genuine care for the people and issues involved. This wasn't emotional manipulation or false performance. It was taking responsibility for bringing my best self to every interaction. I realized that people respond not just to what you say or do, but to who you are being in the moment. Your emotional presence communicates more powerfully than your words, and it influences how others feel and think in your presence. During my eventual return to limited service under the Medici, this principle proved invaluable. Many expected me to be either obsequious in my gratitude or defensive about my past. Instead, I maintained a calm confidence that acknowledged the realities of my situation while demonstrating my continued value as a strategic thinker. The key insight is that emotional mastery isn't about controlling your feelings. It's about choosing which feelings to cultivate and express. Every emotion serves a purpose, but not every emotion serves every situation. Anger can fuel determination, but it undermines careful analysis. Fear can inspire caution, but it paralyzes bold action. Love can motivate sacrifice, but it can cloud judgment about necessary difficult decisions. I developed a practice of what I called emotional intentionality, consciously choosing the emotional tone I wanted to bring to each day and each interaction. This required honest self-assessment of my current emotional state, clear thinking about what the situation required, and deliberate cultivation of the feelings that would best serve everyone involved. On my desk sits a detailed map of Renaissance Italy, marked with the complex web of alliances, trade routes, and influence networks that shaped our world. This map taught me to see emotional influence as an interconnected system rather than isolated transactions. And understanding these patterns can multiply your impact exponentially while building sustainable, long-term power. During my years in the Chancery, I initially approached each relationship and negotiation as a separate challenge. I would focus intensely on the immediate parties involved, crafting my approach to their specific needs and circumstances. While this produced some successes, I gradually realized I was missing the larger architecture of influence that could amplify my efforts. The breakthrough came when I began mapping not just political alliances, but emotional influence patterns. I started tracking who respected whom, who feared whom, who sought approval from whom. I noticed that certain individuals served as emotional amplifiers when they endorsed an idea or person. Their opinion carried weight far beyond their formal authority. For instance, I discovered that Francesco Vettori, while holding a relatively modest official position, had the trust and ear of several key Medici family members. More importantly, other Florentine nobles looked to him for cues about how to respond to new political developments. By cultivating a strong relationship with Francesco, I could influence not just his opinions, but the opinions of everyone who valued his judgment. This insight transformed my approach to building influence networks. Instead of trying to convince everyone individually, I focused on identifying and influencing the emotional center points, those people whose reactions shaped others' reactions. These weren't always the most powerful people in formal terms, but they were the ones others watched for emotional guidance. I began categorizing people in my network according to their influence patterns. Some were amplifiers who spread opinions and feelings to many others. Some were bridges who connected different groups and could carry influence across social or political boundaries. Some were validators whose approval made others feel confident about their own choices. The most effective strategy was to create what I called influence chains, sequences of relationships where positive regard flowed naturally from person to person. If I could earn the respect of someone who was already respected by my ultimate target, that endorsement carried far more weight than any direct approach I could make. During the complex negotiations around the League of Cambrai, I spent weeks mapping these emotional influence patterns among the various diplomatic parties. I identified that the French ambassador, while officially leading their delegation, actually deferred to the judgment of his chief secretary on matters of honor and protocol. The secretary, in turn, had deep respect for a particular Venetian diplomat known for his cultural sophistication. Armed with this understanding, I cultivated a relationship with the Venetian diplomat, not around the immediate political issues, but around our shared interest in classical literature and philosophy. As he came to see me as a learned and thoughtful person, he mentioned his positive impression to the French secretary. The secretary's favorable opinion then influenced the ambassador's willingness to consider our proposals seriously. This indirect approach achieved in weeks what months of direct negotiation had failed to accomplish. By working through the natural influence patterns, I had created authentic endorsement rather than forced agreement. Those same principles apply powerfully in modern organizations. Every workplace has its own influence networks that may bear little resemblance to the formal organizational chart. The junior employee who has everyone's respect for her integrity, the middle manager whose strategic insights are widely valued, the administrative assistant who knows everything that's really happening. These people often wield more emotional influence than their titles suggest. Understanding these patterns requires careful observation and genuine relationship building. You need to notice whose opinions others seek, whose approval they value, whose concerns they take seriously. Then you must invest in authentic relationships with these influence multipliers, not for immediate gain, but for long-term mutual benefit. The key is patience and authenticity. Influence networks are built on trust and respect, which develop slowly through consistent behavior and genuine care for others' success. But once established, these networks create compound returns that can accelerate your impact far beyond what individual efforts could achieve. I learned to maintain what I called an influence inventory, a mental map of who influenced whom in my professional environment, how those relationships were evolving, and where I could add value to strengthen the overall network. This systematic approach to relationship building became one of my most powerful tools for creating lasting change. In my collection rests a papal ring given to me by Pope Leo X, the symbol of ultimate earthly authority that still required masterful emotional influence to wield effectively. This artifact taught me the advanced techniques for handling emotional resistance and transforming opposition into cooperation, skills that become essential as your influence grows and the stakes increase. The ring came to me after I had successfully mediated a dispute between the Pope and several rebellious cardinals, who were threatening to call a council to challenge his authority. What made this situation particularly complex was that the cardinals had legitimate grievances, significant support, and nothing to lose by continuing their opposition. Traditional approaches, threats, bribes, or appeals to papal authority had only hardened their resistance. I realized that direct confrontation would only escalate the conflict. Instead, I needed to find a way to transform their opposition energy into collaborative energy. The technique I developed, I came to call emotional Aikido, using the force of resistance to create forward momentum rather than trying to overcome it directly. My first step was to genuinely understand and validate their concerns. During private meetings with each cardinal, I listened carefully to their grievances and acknowledged the legitimacy of their feelings. I didn't argue with their perceptions or try to convince them they were wrong. Instead, I helped them feel heard and understood, which began to diffuse their emotional charge. The key insight was that resistance often contains valuable information about what people really need. These cardinals weren't opposing the Pope out of mere ambition or spite. They felt excluded from important decisions, disrespected in their roles, and concerned about directions that affected their own territories and responsibilities. Once I understood their underlying needs, I could begin reframing the situation. Instead of presenting papal authority as something they needed to submit to, I helped them see how their expertise and experience could strengthen the Church's leadership. I positioned them not as rebels to be subdued, but as valuable advisors, whose input could improve papal decision-making. This reframing changed the entire dynamic. Instead of fighting against papal authority, they began working to ensure that authority was exercised wisely. Their resistance energy transformed into constructive engagement, and what had begun as a serious threat to papal unity became an opportunity to strengthen church governance. The technique works because it addresses the emotional roots of resistance rather than just its surface manifestations. When people oppose your ideas or leadership, they're usually trying to protect something they value: their autonomy, their competence, their security, their sense of justice. If you can show them how cooperation actually better serves those deeper values, resistance dissolves naturally. I developed several specific approaches for different types of resistance. When facing emotional resistance based on fear, I would focus on providing security and reassurance. When encountering resistance rooted in pride, I would find ways to preserve or even enhance the person's dignity and status. When dealing with resistance based on past negative experiences, I would acknowledge those experiences while demonstrating how this situation was different. During my later consulting work with various Italian princes, I frequently encountered advisors who resisted my counsel not because my ideas lacked merit, but because accepting outside advice felt like an admission that they couldn't handle their responsibilities alone. Rather than arguing for the quality of my recommendations, I would frame our work as a collaboration that enhanced their own capabilities. I might say something like, "Your Excellency, your deep knowledge of local conditions is exactly what these strategies need to succeed. I can provide the broader framework, but you're the one who understands how to adapt these approaches to your specific circumstances." This positioning transformed me from a threat to their competence into a resource that amplified their effectiveness. Another crucial technique is what I learned to call resistance mapping, systematically identifying all the ways people might oppose your influence and preparing responses that address their underlying concerns. This isn't about manipulation or deception. It's about genuine problem solving that serves everyone's legitimate interests. In modern contexts, this might mean anticipating that a colleague will resist your project proposal because they're worried about increased workload, then proactively addressing how the project could actually make their job easier. or recognizing that a team member opposes a new process because they fear it will diminish their expertise, then finding ways to position them as leaders in implementing the change. The most powerful application of emotional Aikido is learning to welcome resistance as valuable feedback rather than viewing it as an obstacle to overcome. When someone pushes back against your ideas, they're often highlighting real problems that need to be addressed or revealing needs that should be incorporated into your approach. On my shelf sits a collection of medicinal herbs I gathered during my exile, simple plants that helped me maintain mental clarity during the most emotionally turbulent period of my life. These humble remedies taught me crucial lessons about protecting yourself from emotional manipulation while maintaining the authentic relationships that make influence meaningful rather than merely transactional. During my banishment, I encountered individuals who attempted to exploit my vulnerable position for their own advantage. Some offered false friendship while seeking information they could sell to my enemies. Others tried to manipulate my desperation to secure favors or commitments that would have compromised my integrity. These experiences forced me to develop what I came to think of as emotional armor, protection that preserved my authentic capacity for connection while shielding me from those who would abuse it. The challenge was learning to distinguish between genuine relationship building and manipulative exploitation. Both involve attention to emotions and careful communication, but their underlying intentions and long-term effects are completely different. Authentic influence seeks mutual benefit and respects the other person's autonomy. Manipulation seeks one-sided advantage and treats others as objects to be used. I learned to recognize the warning signs of manipulative behavior. Manipulators often create artificial urgency, pressuring you to make decisions before you have time to think clearly. They frequently use your own values and emotions against you, making you feel guilty for not complying with their requests. They tend to isolate you from other perspectives that might help you see their behavior objectively. Most importantly, I noticed that interactions with manipulative people left me feeling drained, confused, or somehow diminished, even when they seemed friendly and supportive on the surface. Genuine influence, by contrast, tends to leave everyone feeling energized and valued, even when difficult topics are discussed or hard decisions are made. To protect myself, I developed several practical strategies. First, I learned to slow down important decisions, especially when someone was pushing for immediate commitment. I would say something like, "This deserves careful consideration. Let me reflect on it and get back to you." This simple pause often revealed whether someone was genuinely interested in my thoughtful participation or just wanted quick compliance. Second, I began seeking multiple perspectives on important matters, especially when someone was asking me to act in ways that felt uncomfortable or contrary to my usual judgment. Manipulators often try to become your only source of information about a situation, so they can shape your perception without challenge. Third, I learned to pay attention to my emotional state during and after interactions. If I consistently felt anxious, guilty, or confused around someone, even when I couldn't identify specific problematic behavior, I would create more distance and boundaries in that relationship. But perhaps most importantly, I discovered that the best protection against manipulation is developing such a strong sense of your own values and objectives that attempts to exploit you become obvious immediately. When you know clearly what you want to accomplish and why, it becomes much easier to recognize when someone is trying to redirect your energy toward their purposes at the expense of your own. This understanding also helped me ensure that my own influence efforts remained ethical and beneficial. I established personal guidelines for how I would use the emotional influence techniques I had developed. I would only seek influence in service of outcomes that genuinely benefited all parties involved. I would never use emotional appeals to get people to act against their own legitimate interests. and I would always respect others' right to say no, even when their refusal inconvenienced me. The goal was to become what I thought of as a clean influencer, someone whose success came from helping others achieve their own worthy objectives, not from exploiting their weaknesses or manipulating their emotions. This approach proved more sustainable and ultimately more powerful than any manipulative technique could have been in practice. This meant being transparent about my own interests, while working to understand and serve others' interests. When I needed support for a project, I would explain clearly what I hoped to accomplish and why, then explore how that objective aligned with what others wanted to achieve. This honesty built trust that made future influence much easier and more effective. The herbs I gathered taught me that protection and healing often come from the same sources. The practices that shielded me from manipulation also strengthened my capacity for authentic connection. By learning to recognize and resist emotional exploitation, I became better at offering and receiving genuine influence that served everyone involved. Above my desk hangs a small family portrait painted during my years at San Castiana. My wife Marietta and our children gathered in our modest but warm home. This painting reminds me daily that the ultimate test of emotional mastery is not how effectively you can influence strangers or colleagues, but how skillfully you can integrate these principles into your most important relationships while preserving their authenticity and love. The greatest challenge I faced was not learning emotional influence techniques, but applying them ethically and sustainably in my daily life. It would have been easy to become manipulative with those closest to me, using my understanding of human psychology to get my way in family matters or friendships. But I quickly realized that such an approach would poison the very relationships that gave my life meaning. Instead, I had to develop what I came to think of as loving influence, the ability to guide and inspire those I cared about while deepening rather than exploiting our emotional connections. This required a completely different approach than the strategic influence I used in political contexts. With my family, the goal was never to win or to get my way, but to help all of us thrive together. When my children resisted my guidance about their studies or behavior, I learned to understand their underlying needs and concerns, rather than simply asserting parental authority. If my son, Antonio, was avoiding his Latin lessons, I would explore whether the material was too difficult, too boring, or whether he was worried about disappointing me with imperfect performance. Once I understood his emotional state, I could address the real issue rather than just the surface behavior. If he was struggling with difficulty, I could provide additional support or find a different teaching approach. If he was bored, I could help him see connections between Latin and subjects that interested him more. If he was afraid of failure, I could reassure him that learning required mistakes and that his effort mattered more than his immediate results. This approach took more time and patience than simple commands, but it built genuine understanding and cooperation that lasted far beyond any specific lesson or situation. More importantly, it strengthened our relationship while achieving the practical objectives I had for his education. With Marietta, I learned that emotional influence in marriage required absolute transparency about my intentions and feelings. Any attempt to be strategic or manipulative would have violated the trust that made our partnership possible. Instead, I focused on understanding her perspectives completely and helping her understand mine, so we could make decisions that truly served our shared life together. When we disagreed about important matters, how to handle financial challenges during my exile, whether to accept certain social invitations, how to guide our children through various difficulties, would resist the temptation to use persuasion techniques to convince her to adopt my preferences. Instead, I would share my thinking openly, listen carefully to her concerns and insights, and work together to find approaches that honored both of our values and judgment. This process often led to better decisions than either of us would have made alone, and it strengthened our partnership by ensuring that both of us felt heard, respected, and valued in our relationship. I also had to learn how to practice emotional influence with friends and neighbors in ways that enhanced rather than exploited our connections. In the small community of San Cassiano, relationships had to be sustainable over many years, and any reputation for manipulation or self-serving behavior would have made life difficult for my entire family. I discovered that the same principles that worked in political contexts could be applied authentically in personal relationships if the underlying intention was genuine care for everyone's well-being. When organizing community projects or resolving local disputes, I would use my understanding of emotional dynamics to help people communicate more effectively and find solutions that served the common good. For example, when two of my neighbors had a conflict over property boundaries, I didn't try to convince either one to accept a particular solution. Instead, I helped them understand each other's concerns and fears, then facilitated a conversation that allowed them to develop their own resolution. My role was to create emotional safety and clarity that enabled their own wisdom and goodwill to emerge. The key insight was that emotional influence becomes authentic and sustainable when it serves love rather than ego, when it builds community rather than advancing personal agenda, and when it empowers others rather than diminishing them. Used this way, these skills strengthen relationships and create environments where everyone can flourish. Creating a personal system for continuous improvement meant developing daily practices that kept my skills sharp while ensuring they remained rooted in genuine care for others. I would reflect each evening on my interactions throughout the day, asking myself whether I had used my understanding of emotions to help or to manipulate, to build trust or to gain advantage, to serve shared purposes or to satisfy personal desires. On my writing desk lies the final quill with which I penned my last political insights. Simple goose feather that has witnessed the evolution of my understanding from raw ambition to mature wisdom. As I near the end of my earthly journey, I want to leave you with the most important truths I have discovered about emotional influence and the responsibility that comes with this powerful knowledge. The ability to understand and guide human emotions is perhaps the most potent force available to any individual. It can create kingdoms or destroy them, build lasting relationships or manipulate temporary advantages, elevate others or exploit their vulnerabilities. With this power comes the fundamental choice that will define not just your success, but your character and legacy. I have seen emotional influence used to inspire ordinary people to extraordinary achievements, to bring peace between warring factions, to create prosperity and security for entire communities. I have also witnessed it employed to deceive the innocent, to exploit the desperate, and to advance selfish interests at others' expense. The techniques are the same. The difference lies entirely in the heart and intention of the person wielding them. My challenge to you is this: use these principles to become someone worthy of the influence you seek. Let your growing power over human emotions be matched by an equally growing commitment to using that power in service of worthy purposes. The world has enough clever manipulators. It desperately needs more wise leaders who can inspire the best in others while achieving meaningful objectives. Remember that every person you influence is someone's beloved child, parent, or friend. They have dreams, fears, and hopes just as precious to them as yours are to you. When you choose to guide their emotions, you are accepting responsibility for their well-being and growth, not just for your own success. This responsibility should humble you and elevate your intentions simultaneously. The true test of your mastery will not be how effectively you can get people to do what you want, but how skillfully you can help them become who they are capable of being. The highest form of emotional influence is that which leaves others stronger, wiser, and more capable than they were before they encountered you. I have learned that sustainable influence requires authentic virtue, not just strategic skill. People will follow someone they trust far longer and more completely than someone they merely fear or admire. Building that trust requires consistency between your public actions and private character, between what you promise and what you deliver, between how you treat those who can help you and those who cannot. The principles I have shared with you are not merely techniques to be deployed when convenient. They are disciplines to be practiced daily until they become as natural as breathing. The person who masters emotional influence while maintaining ethical integrity becomes a force for genuine good in the world, capable of creating positive change that ripples through generations. But beware the seductive trap of believing that your worthy ends justify any means necessary to achieve them. I have seen too many well-intentioned people compromise their principles in pursuit of important objectives, only to discover that their methods corrupted both their goals and themselves. The path you take shapes who you become as surely as the destination you reach. As you practice these arts of influence, pay careful attention to how they change you. Are you becoming more patient or more impatient with those who disagree with you? More understanding of human nature or more cynical about human motives? More committed to truth or more comfortable with deception? Your influence over others will ultimately be limited by your influence over yourself. The legacy you leave will not be measured primarily by the positions you attain or the wealth you accumulate, but by the people whose lives you touch and the positive changes you help create. Years from now, will people remember you as someone who helped them discover their own strength and wisdom, or as someone who used their weaknesses for personal advantage? I have lived through times of great political upheaval, witnessed the rise and fall of princes, and observed how power shifts like morning mist. What endures is not the temporary authority that comes from position or wealth, but the lasting influence that comes from touching human hearts and elevating human potential. Use these principles wisely. Practice them with integrity. Let them serve not just your ambitions, but your highest aspirations for yourself and for the world you help create. In doing so, you will join the ranks of those who wield true power, the power to inspire, to heal, and to build something greater than themselves. This is my final counsel to you. Become someone whose influence makes the world more beautiful, more just, and more hopeful than it was before you exercised your power over human hearts.